Yeah, family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
The next chapter in Father Richard Goula's book is Kinds of Sin. So we're going to talk about sin. And when we talk about sin, typically what we're talking about is not original sin, because when we go to confession, we're not confessing our original sin. What are we confessing? We're confessing what we call our personal sin. What's the difference between original sin and personal sin? Original sin, you don't have any responsibility for. You didn't do anything with respect to original sin. Personal sin are the things that you have done, either as an individual or by participating in social sin. So let's get original sin out of the way first. We've talked about this concept of original sin before. It's a code word, says Father Richard Goula, for living in a world where we're influenced by evil and brokenness. Think about that. So our ancient ancestors, the ones who wrote the Bible, had to figure out, where does evil come from in the world? And they had to come up with an answer. Our Greek ancestors, have you heard the Greek story? When they came up with the story of where evil came from, who did they blame for evil? They blamed it on Pandora. Remember the story of Pandora's box? How it was that Pandora opened the box and boom, all the evil in the world came out of the box. Okay? How did the ancient Hebrews explain the origin of evil? They explained it as, Adam and Eve were in the garden and did what they weren't supposed to do. It's the Pandora story in our own Bible. So original sin then is a code word for how it is that we're born into this evil, broken world, explained by events like Adam and Eve. How it is that we live in this world that poisons our freedom, our ability to love. How it is that we see things like the apple and we're tempted toward evil. That's original sin. Now we talk about actual sin, which is the sin that we commit. We didn't commit original sin. That was just something that we have by being born. You have original sin, said the ancient church. Actual sin is the sin, though, that we commit. Traditionally, we've divided sins into two categories. We remember this. It was very strong up through the 1960s until we started rethinking these things. What were the two categories of sins? The two categories of sins were mortal sins and venial sins. Mortal sins, the serious sins you're going to go to hell for. Venial sins, you're probably not going to go to hell for a venial sin, but let's talk about the impact of both of these. So where does the whole mortal sin, venial sin divide come from? Is that in the Bible? Does the Bible say these are mortal sins and these are venial sins? No. In fact, the Bible doesn't even support reducing sins into two categories. What we've done is we had all sorts of rules. Essentially what happened then was with mortal and venial sins then was we started putting things into one of two categories. Is it a mortal sin or is it a venial sin? Eating pork, is that a mortal sin or a venial sin? Okay, well, let's find a place for it. What about working on the Lord's Day on the Sabbath? Mortal sin or venial sin? When we start classifying every one of these laws into mortal sins and venial sins. And not only these laws, but everything else too, okay? What if I eat a hot dog on a Friday of Lent? What kind of sin is that? So let's take a look at the biblical foundations for mortal sin. Mortal comes from the Latin root, which simply means death. What are those sins that cause death? Paul lists sins that can exclude you from the reign of God. In his first letter to the Corinthians and in the letter to the Galatians, he says, if you do these things, you can't get into God's kingdom. Oh, okay. That seems that then would fit our definition of a mortal sin. If you do these things, you're not going to heaven. Jesus says that blasphemy against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. Wait a minute. So there are many sins that are forgiven. The prodigal son went off, came back, and was forgiven. But in the same Gospel of Luke, he talks about a certain sin that will not be forgiven. There is one sin that if you do it, and then you turn around, God is not going to forgive you. Whoa. Seems that would fit that definition of a mortal sin then. The clearest reference to degrees of sin then might be from the first letter of John, where he speaks of deadly sins versus those that are not deadly. And so it's like the initial thought for mortal sins then might come from the first letter of John, where we talk about these sins are mortal and lead to death. These sins are not mortal and are not deadly sins. That's the Bible. After the Bible's written then, Tertullian comes along. Tertullian, born in 160 AD, roughly. He was the first one to speak of mortal sins. And the way that what was he talking about in mortal sins? So we had, okay, if you commit a sin, then we as a church, you come to the church and we forgive you. Tertullian was of the belief that if someone comes to a presbyter, an elder of the church, a priest, and says that they've committed certain sins, that person should not be forgiven. What are some of those sins? Idolatry, blasphemy, murder, adultery, fornication, false witness, fraud, and lying. If you do some of these things, then when you come to the church, the priest, in that age, the presbyter or the elder, should not forgive you. Why? Because then, if you do these things, and then I forgive you, wait a minute, that means the name is in this room could do these things. Follow me? Do we understand what some of them are? Idolatry, turning away from God to other gods. Blasphemy, right? Speaking about God in a disrespectful way. Murder, okay, that was clear enough. Adultery, is that acting like an adult? No. What's the difference between adultery and fornication? So let's start first with fornication. Fornication is having sex outside of a committed relationship. So long as you're in a relationship where you've committed yourselves to one another, then you can have sex, says the church. If you're having sex with a person outside of a committed relationship, the fancy word that we've had for that in the history of the church was fornication. What is adultery then? Adultery then is if you are in a committed relationship and then have a sexual relation with a person outside of that relationship, then that's adultery. So fornication, having sex outside of a committed relationship. Fornication, having sex with another person outside of the person with which you're in a committed relationship. False witness, that would be lying. Ooh, can't forgive liars. Fraud, lying, okay. So what's the context for Tertullian? We know that Tertullian was a Montanist. What did the Montanists believe? They believed that we are too lenient in forgiving sins. Because if we just forgive sins, then they're going to go off and do these things. Right? If suddenly we say that we're going to forgive those who fornicate, who have sex, what does that mean? Then people are going to go have sex and then they'll come back and ask for forgiveness. Better for us to say, there is no forgiveness. Don't fornicate. Don't lie. Don't do the things that are on this list because you won't be forgiven. You're going to go to Father Jamie and he's going to say, I'm sorry, but you had sex. I don't forgive people who had sex. I don't forgive people who murder, people who are idolaters, and people who had sex. And people who lie. Bad news.
Your partner dies, and then you remarry.
Good question. If your partner dies then that bond is dissolved. So you're free to marry. The church has always said that if your partner dies, now if you murder, that murder's here on the list. If your partner dies, poisoning would be murder, Mario. So if a person dies, then that union is dissolved and the person is free to enter into marriage again. Both in the eyes of the church and in civil society as well. So the Montanists believe that if you're too lenient in forgiving sins, then that only encourages people to do those things. If you lie and then come to Father Jamie and he forgives you, then you're just going to go off and lie to other people knowing, well, I'll lie because I know that Father Jamie will forgive me. Oh, no, Father Jamie is no longer forgiving liars.
Depends on the lie.
You're on to something, it depends on the lie. Back then, though, black and white, there are certain sins that Father Jamie will not forgive. And if you come here saying that you lied, Mario, I am sorry, you lied.
Wow.
I don't forgive liars. So that was in the time of Tertullian. Now, from the 4th to the 6th centuries, we're starting to develop canonical penance. Canonical penance. That means that we're coming up with a list of sins, and you come and confess your sins to the priest, and the priest gives you a penance. We're developing canonical penance. from the 4th to the 6th century, and we decided, okay, wait a minute, there are some sins that you don't have to come to me for. You can just do your personal mortification, which means that you can beat yourself and or do your own fasting and or do whatever it is that you want to do in the privacy of your own home to make up for your sins. You can do that for venial sins, for one type of sin, and just bring your serious sins to Father Jamie. How's that for a deal? Come to Father Jamie with the serious sins. All of the other sins you take care of at home. So canonical penance then was necessary only for mortal sins, not for venial sins. Deacon?
But if mortal sins are serious sins, why would I want to come to you with only serious sins, knowing that you're not going to forgive me?
Excellent question. So that was Tertullian saying that we shouldn't forgive people for these sins. But now that we're developing canonical penance, then we are going to be forgiving people for these sins. For murder, you can come, if you murdered Angelita, come to me. If you didn't murder, if you committed a venial sin, whatever we determine a venial sin to be, you told a white lie. Okay, you take care of your own personal mortification at home for that. Whether that's kneeling on rice and saying 3 rosaries, or whatever your personal mortification is, whatever you do to atone to God, you go do that. Follow me? Kneeling on a keyboard, I've heard some pretty crazy things as a priest, right? Okay, so personal mortification for venial sins, mortal sins bring to the church. Fourth Lateran Council, we're fast forwarding now to the 13th century, 1215, mandated annual confession of mortal sins. So at least once a year, you have to go to confession to confess your mortal sins. Have you heard that before? You have to go to confession at least once a year? That comes from 1215, Fourth Lateran Council.
Are there any rules about going to confession or going, because I'm not Catholic or because I've never had my first communion or anything like that? Would I be able to go to confession? Am I expected
Excellent
to go to
question.
confession? How does one join in Catholicism?
Excellent question. So with we know that reconciliation is one of the sacraments of the church. Is it the first sacrament of the church? No. What's the first sacrament? The first one is baptism. After that, there's no order. So long as a person is baptized, he or she can go to the celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation. Go to confession, we call it. Back to the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215. So now that the Fourth Lateran Council is saying that you have to confess your mortal sins at least once a year, it's important for us to know what's a mortal sin. What is the Fourth Lateran Council going to say? Okay, if we're now saying that you have to confess your mortal sins once a year, then we have to understand what is a mortal sin. We came up with 3 requirements. In order for something to be a mortal sin, a deadly sin, 1, there must be sufficient reflection, which means that you understand what's happening here. You know that what you're going to do is a sin. If you don't know what you're going to do is a sin, then you're not sinning, right? People who don't have that capacity to understand that they're sinning, children, whatever, they don't sin in the same way as adults who know, okay, this is a sin, but I'm going to do it anyways. There must be sufficient reflection. There must be full consent, which means that you're free to do it. If you're being pressured or forced to do something, then you're no longer free. And there must also be serious matter, which means it's got to be a serious enough choice that by choosing to do it, you're choosing to become a certain way. And that way is not facing the direction of God. Remember, we call it fundamental option. You're essentially making a negative fundamental option. This is a serious enough thing that you're turning your back on God. This is not a simple white lie where you're still turned toward God even though your actions are inconsistent with that. This is, okay, I'm doing something which I know is going to turn me away from God. What's a contemporary perspective on mortal sin then? Sometimes theologians often use mortal sin as a sort of shorthand for negative fundamental option. Fundamental option is what direction are those major choices that we make to turn in a certain direction. So to make a negative fundamental option means turning our back on God or on others. So if I am consciously choosing, if I deliberate this matter, if there's sufficient reflection, I know what I'm doing, and freedom, I am free to do this, and I'm going to choose to turn my back on God, then that would be a mortal sin where I go through with it.
So they were able to determine the sufficient reflection of a mortal sin, meaning a right or wrong. How were they determined to know that if you were right or wrong about committing that mortal sin?
There you go. Hold that question. We're going to come to that in just a moment here, because essentially the question is, how do we know if something really is a mortal sin? Because you got to confess your mortal sins once a year. We said that in 1215, 800 years ago this year. We made the decision for the last 800 years. You got to go to confession at least. You have to go to confession at least once a year to confess your mortal sins. For 800 years now we've been saying that. Fundamental stance in all of this, in a contemporary moral theology, what's important is your fundamental stance, which simply means what direction are you facing in life? What is the fundamental orientation of your life? Are you facing in the direction of God? Or have you turned your back on God and others, and are you heading in a different direction? What's your fundamental orientation, your fundamental direction in life? That's what's important. Single actions have to be understood in context of that, because some small actions, even though you're facing this direction, we do some things that don't alter our direction radically, right? If I tell a white lie to my child about how it is that some bearded white man is going to bring gifts at night, right? That doesn't make me an evil person that has turned his back on God. Interesting. Father Richard Gould tells us, many of the crimes that we see on the news, did you tune into the news this evening? Think of any crime. Many of the crimes that we see, he says, they seem too much like mental illness or poisoned toxic states to be considered voluntary acts of final rejection of God. Most of the things we see on the news are not people who sit down and think, you know what, I'm going to do this because by doing this, I know that I'm going to turn my back on God. Follow me? For more people, it springs from other things like, say, mental illness. I take this extremely seriously as a priest. 1 out of every 4 people in the United States, according to one study, 1 out of every 4 people in the United States during any given year suffers symptoms of mental illness. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. And so rather than thinking that they're evil people, it could be attributed to something else. He says certainly an individual has a certain degree of moral culpability, of guilt, for getting into such an out-of-control state by not making use of necessary help, but only once such a person has become drugged or crazed, then he or she can hardly be free to sin voluntarily with full knowledge of what is being done. Think about that for a moment. When I take the first drink, okay, I'm making the decision to take a drink. But at the same time, is that such a terrible thing that I'm turning my back on God? I mean, it's not such a big thing. It's just the decision to have a drink. But what happens then is that drink after drink, what happens once I get drunk? Then am I able to sin? I'm no longer able to sin. Because I am not conscious of what it is that I'm doing in the same way that were I not drunk or drugged. Follow me? So you have to be evaluating the situation and knowing what you're doing and consciously choosing to do that for it to be a mortal sin.
But let's say the person is drunk and gets in the car and drives and kills someone
There you
else.
go.
You know, so did he commit a mortal sin or did he not?
Excellent question.
Because we know the consequences. We know the
Yeah.
consequences before we get drunk.
Our laws are
We know.
strong.
We don't give up our keys and say, okay, I might drive.
The question is that a mortal sin? According to the Council, the Fourth Lateran Council, there are 3 criteria.
Cars.
And so essentially what happened is from the 1215 on, we were able to evaluate, okay, that drunk driver who killed the person has to satisfy these 3 things for it to be a mortal sin. And the challenge is that no one in this room can judge that person with respect to these. Or at least with 2 of the 3. So sufficient reflection, who of us knows whether that person really intended to do what he or she did and did it with that intent? Sufficient reflection. Full consent, was free to do it. You know, once you're in a different state of mind, are you free to be, are you free? And then a serious matter that expresses the sort of person they wish to become. Did their doing that express the type of person? If they did it on purpose, if you get into your car and go out and kill another person on purpose in a sane state of mind, then that is definitely a mortal sin. If you're doing it aware of what you're doing with full consent, knowing that you're free, and knowing that by doing this you can turn your back on God. That's a mortal sin. Where it gets more gray are all these other situations, which is why we have to be so careful before we go judging other people's mortal sins.
I mean, nobody gets drunk and then gets in the car and wants to kill somebody else.
There you go.
Like, nobody, I mean, I
There's no
don't,
intent.
maybe that's super
There you
naive,
go.
but I feel like
Intent.
nobody ever really.
So, the last sentence of Father Richard Gould's line then says, no doubt these people perpetrate evil and cause untold harm. There's no doubt about that. That drunk driver perpetrated evil and caused harm. No one's going to argue that. But can we say they are committing mortal sin in the fullest sense of the word? And that's where we have to be careful.
Right.
Because the question is it a sin to do X, whatever X is? Is it a sin to do a certain thing? And that depends. It depends on those three things from the fourth Lateran Council. So to commit a mortal sin depends on the fulfillment of those three conditions. So we have to be careful with lists of mortal sins. It's a mortal sin to do such and such. Why? Because unless we presume that the person had that evaluative knowledge and that basic freedom, it can only be understood as a mortal sin in a limited way. That would be understood, for instance, as a mortal sin in a limited way, because unless we could be certain about those three conditions of fulfillment, we can't say with certainty that it's a mortal sin. It caused evil and harm. That no one's going to argue with that. So we have to be careful about judging the mortal sins of others, only because we don't know how much freedom went into that, or how much knowledge went into that act, and so it's difficult. Be careful about judging other people's sins. Judge your own sins. You know better than I how much freedom and knowledge went into what it is that you did. Judge your own sins. Don't judge other people's sins.
We know alcoholism is not of God. So mental illness, how do you define that? I mean, it's yes, evil acts are committed because of mental illness, but is that something that God has a hand in healing?
So let's go back to the notion of original sin. Original sin is this idea that we're born into a broken, evil world. Simply meaning, each of us is born into a human body. Got news for you. Human bodies don't last forever. They wear down over time. We're in broken bodies. God, wish you could live forever in your body? Got news for you. The body breaks down. Same thing with, we're born into the body. And some of these bodies, sometimes a person catches cancer, not because God wants people to have cancer. I'm going to give her cancer today. No. We're all born into human bodies, which have cells that multiply themselves, right? Our cells are constantly multiplying themselves. And when something goes wrong in that multiplication, cancer results.
Right.
It's natural. Okay? Now let's use the example, where were we going with this?
Mental
Mental illness, thank you. Mental illness. In the case of mental illness, for instance, the brain is such, talk about this body. Okay, we're already in broken bodies, but you think that someone is perfect, got news for you. The chemicals inside a person's brain, if they get out of balance for whatever reason, suddenly that person is saying and doing things that that person wouldn't say or do otherwise. You follow me? And so, is that person committing a sin and willfully wanting to turn that person's back on God? No, that person is having a challenge right now. So mental illness is tough, because unless judge your own sins, because you know better than others, why it is that you said or did certain things, only that person knows why he or she said or did what he or she said or did.
Something like a person with Alzheimer's disease.
With anything that limits your freedom and or your knowledge, it's no longer mortal sin. Person with anything that limits his or her freedom or knowledge, he or she does something or says something, he or she is no longer responsible. In the same way. Bernard Herring continues, there can be no mortal sin without a fundamental option or the intention that turns one's basic freedom toward evil. It's not a mortal sin unless there is that fundamental option. I am going to choose evil
I'm
today.
gonna go join the
I am in my right mind. I know what I'm doing. I know that I'm turning my back on God and doing this, and I'm going to go do it. One of the challenges with mortal sin then is, okay, let's presume to judge another person for a moment. Adolf Hitler, good Catholic. Why don't we judge our brothers and sisters like, okay, Adolf Hitler. Let's presume that he knew exactly what he was doing. He had the freedom to do it. He chose to do it knowing that he was turning his back on God. What happens then when you do all of that? You've made your fundamental option in the other direction, and then you realize you turn around, which is what Bernard Herring is saying here. What if he's genuinely sorry after that sin? Because that's another fundamental option. I made a fundamental option to turn my back on God, but before you die, be careful about judging others because you don't know what other fundamental option, if any, they've made. Which is why the church does not damn anyone to hell. Because you don't know what fundamental option, what turn they've made toward God and or to others. They may have died. You have that family member who, that's SOB, glad that he or she is, oh, you know what, don't judge that person because you never know. You never know what was going on in that person's mind and or in that person's life. Did that person knowingly do what he or she did? Was he or she free to do those things? And did they do those things with the intent of hurting you and others, or was it other things in their lives? A contemporary perspective on venial sin. So that's mortal sin, those life-changing, negative, fundamental options where we turn away from God purposefully. What about venial sins? Because most sins don't radically reverse our relationship with God, like that sin of telling my child that a bearded white man is going to come and leave him gifts tonight. I know it's a lie. I'm going to tell her anyways. That doesn't radically alter my relationship with God. Not radically. And so those sorts of sins we might put in the realm of venial sin. Venial sin then is acting inconsistently with our basic commitment to be for life and for love. So my commitment is essentially in this direction, but I do a few things that are inconsistent with that. I say some things, I do some things that are inconsistent with the direction I want to be going in. And so, Father Richard Gould says, while I may be fundamentally a caring person, my occasional acts of aloofness and causing harm do not radically change the sort of person I am, though they may weaken my commitment to love and justice. Venial sins, he says, venial sins cannot be dismissed as being of no account. We can't say that venial sins are nothing, only because what happens is they do have an impact. They have an impact on others, they have an impact on us. A contemporary perspective on social sin. So we talked about individual or private sin, the things that I do. What about the things that we do? This was difficult for me because you know what? For the 10 years that I was a priest in the Roman Catholic Church, I thanked God every day that I was a priest in the Roman Catholic Church, but I also lived in this tension of participating in various social sins, in structures that oppressed certain people. That's what social sin is all about. So social sin is how it is that certain systems shape our existence for the worse, and how it is that individual choices form structures in which people suffer from various forms of oppression and exploitation. Discrimination. If I do anything that discriminates against another person, I'm somehow participating in that system. If someone at school calls someone a name and I remain silent, I am somehow participating in that. Follow me? In this classroom, if someone calls someone else a name and we just go on with class, what just happened? We participated in that dynamic. And so our individual decisions, essentially what's happening is we each make a decision at that moment. And so what happens is Mary Helen now gets upset with Cynthia and says, Cynthia, you... And she says something that Cynthia is absolutely offended. And we decide not to say or do anything, then we are all essentially condoning what happened. You follow me? this becomes serious because on the one hand, it's nothing that I'm going to think about the next time I go to confession, or is it? You know, about how it was that I've been in certain situations, in certain structures, and I've not done anything about it. I went to HEB this last week, and I bought lettuce, and I didn't even ask the person in the produce section where this lettuce came from, and if the people who picked it were paid just wages. You follow me? So by my buying that lettuce, I may have participated in a social sin.
You have participated.
There you go. Better
You paid for
said.
it.
Better said. We all have participated in various social sins, even if we're not aware of it. So what does that mean? Essentially, the big thing is, are we consciously choosing these things? If we consciously choose these things, especially once we're aware of the implications, that's one thing. Before we're conscious, we're less responsible. Now once I find out that HEB is stocking lettuce from a farm in California that's not paying its workers justly, then if I purchase that lettuce, then I am participating knowingly in that social sin. Vincent?
Well, then I have to confess that I do a social sin every week because I am consciously doing a social sin by letting my 700 customers that come into my bar a drink.
Yes and no. So
But according
one drink is not going to radically alter what they do. If you let them drink to the point where they're stumbling out of your bar, and if you're letting them behind a wheel, then you're participating in that.
Yes.
Serving a person a drink, letting a child sip the foam off of your beer is not so evil. But allowing that person to radically alter his or her state as a result of that, that's something that we need to think about.
Because technically, I try to take care of my bars my best as I can. And out of the 700 people that go there every night, 2,100 people a week, 35% of them are really drunk. And me and my bartending staff have socially sinned for letting those 35 people get behind the wheel. 35% of them.
Alcohol is a poison. Our body burns off poisons all the time. So long as I'm taking in alcohol, my body's burning it off. So if I take it in less slowly than I'm burning it off, then I'm okay. If I'm taking it in more quickly, then I gotta be careful. But the same can be true said of other poisons. Mario here is drinking one drink, which if he knew what was contained in this, he'd probably hesitate. Yikes. Right? What happens if we drink too much of this too quickly? Be careful, it's going to affect the body. Otherwise, in moderation, a sip of Coke or a can of Coke is not going to fundamentally alter your health. 12 Cokes a day over 12 years? That could fundamentally change who you are. Deacon?
So we're talking about the possibility of some responsibility in society that such as a bar owner would consider, and any subsequent impact of that liquid that they consume in the bar, and how will we decide when that subsequent impact stops? For instance, let's talk about slavery. We as a society allowed slavery not too long ago.
Yeah.
And now their grandchildren or great-grandchildren may be suffering in poverty. And because of that, environment, crime, and therefore they're in prison. And so at what point does this societal sin or responsibility stop? And or should we all just go to confession every Sunday?
Depends on your role in that. If you are consciously participating, consciously advancing these systems, then you have some part in it, it seems. If, however, because what happens is these structures result from individual choices, but most of us do not set up these structures. We're trying to live with them and to change them, aware of the fact that they're not going to change overnight, many of them, right? whatever, the minimum wage in Austin, okay? We set up a structure that keeps certain people in poverty. It seems that that is a social sin. People are going to rack up all sorts of debt, and we simply don't do anything about it. Okay? But then the question becomes, what is our responsibility then? What can I and or we do about any of the social sins, the structures in which we find ourselves that are oppressing certain groups of people? In the church, some of the ways that we tend to look at this is as liberation theology. Here we see the word liberation theology. We've tended to look at liberation theology as there are certain liberation theologies. The most prominent ones in the church have been Latin America liberation theologies. How it is that first world nations have oppressed third world nations. So Latin American liberation theology recognizes how it is that certain people are oppressed, and we as a church have a duty to side with those who are oppressed, to be in solidarity with them. Okay, that's Latin American liberation theology. Feminist liberation theology recognizes how it is that historically men have oppressed women. Boy, talk about the guilt with which I would sleep as a priest in the Roman Catholic Church, knowing that I am participating in this structure which is keeping women down. To me, that's when you're not knowingly participating in it. It's one thing, right? Okay, it's just part of who the church is. Wait a minute, but then you come to a certain point where you say, wait a minute, I am feeding this system.
So when I was in RA, one of my kids was a freshman, and he was a young white boy from Pennsylvania, from a farm. And he told me that racism wasn't a big deal. And instead of flying off my rocker, like I wanted to, I just asked him of where he was from, and just kind of talked to him a little bit about it and walked away, because I know that the way that Syracuse is set up, you have to take a certain humanities courses, and you have to be faced with a certain set of statistics. And he would have to deal with it later, or not deal with it, because he was in the business school or whatever. But like certain places, certain experiences, you're exposed to it, right? Like you see it. We're intelligent people, and we know that bad things happen. And it's when we choose to ignore them, this willful ignorance, that's when it's different. I think that's where this comes into play. Also, whenever you go to school, whenever you see these things, these problems, something that they really instilled in me, or tried to, was you have to locate yourself within the system. You have to look at your skill set, look at what affects you and your faith, like Vince, like you were talking about. Like, you have to look at yourself and think about all these things at once, and then choose what to do, right? If you feel like you don't know enough, look more. Look for more. And then from that, move if you want. And pick how to disrupt the systems that you see in front of you, the systems of inequality. And try. Because it has to be like a group thing, especially when it comes to social sin. Especially, it's not just a lettuce, but it is just a lettuce.
And I'm just thinking about the American Catholic Church in the United States, okay? We have a few saints that you don't find in the Roman Catholic Church. People like Saint Martin Luther King Jr., Saint Cesar Chavez, Saint Oscar Romero. What do those three have in common? Really, they were people who took a look at the societal structures and were interested in the liberation of people. Martin Luther King Jr. is probably not going to be declared a saint anytime soon by the Roman Catholic Church because he was not a Roman Catholic. We look at him as a saint because he was one of those wise persons who looked at how it is that there's an oppressive system here, and if we're going to live in solidarity, recognizing the worth of every person, if we're going to be faithful to that covenant with God and with one another, then I have an obligation to speak out. So long as someone is oppressed and I'm participating in that structure, I participate in it if I am silent. If I'm silent about it, I am guilty.